And it's just Terrence that's joining us from.
And Liz.
Liz is here. She populated in already.
Okay, Liz. Okay, I think we're all here. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Nice to see everyone. I will make a motion for the board to return to public session. If I could please have a second. Thank you, Rory. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Great. Welcome to members of our community who are joining us. And would you please join us, as is our custom, in rising for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Terrific, thank you. So it's Thursday, March 18th. The board has met several times already in March, and we're looking forward tonight to another opportunity to review the proposed budget. Thank you so much. I guess tonight we're going to revisit our expenditures, which have remained pretty consistent in our conversations. And then we also have the opportunity to learn a little bit about changing circumstances that potentially could affect the revenue side of our budget. We're also really looking forward to an update from you, Andrew, regarding plans to newly reopen our schools. And before we turn our attention to that, we do just want to take a minute to thank you and everybody at this table and all of our administrators and staff members for the enormous work happening every day, not only to keep our schools open and to keep our students engaged in their hybrid model and their virtual, fully remote model, but also with everything that we know it requires to change the model midstream and to create additional opportunity for students to return to school in person. So we thank you very much and look forward to hearing more about how all of that is unfolding. And I will pause before we do all of that, just to invite any board announcements if board members have them. Should we turn it over to Andrew first and then go from there?
Maybe one quick announcement, Marjorie. And I think we all saw the email today, but I actually took a few minutes to check out the Rite of Spring Art. It's a virtual art show for the John Jay High School students put on by Amy Stockfield and the John Jay High School Art Department. And it was really phenomenal. For anybody who hasn't looked at it, I really highly encourage you. All of the different categories range from studio art through photograph and film. Ceramics and sculpture I found really, really interesting. It's amazing what our students are doing, drawing and painting and then AP drawing, and really just fantastic. I kind of got sucked into it, and I really, really enjoyed every minute of it today. So I just encourage people to go take a look.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Rory. Thank you. And I think in previous years, we would have walked into the high school and the walls and spaces in the entryway would have been filled with that art. And so I also really appreciated the timing of the invitation and almost wished we could have an invitation of that nature before every board meeting, because it really was such an opportunity to take pride in the work of our students. And some of the pieces were on display in the Katona Art Museum last month. And to be able to appreciate not only those pieces, but just the full spectrum of art that has been created throughout the year and set to music, no less. It really was moving and thoroughly enjoyable. So we really appreciate the invitation, and thank you so much for remembering to congratulate our students and our art faculty on really inspirational work.
Marjorie, I don't remember if we're able to, after Andrew's announcements, to make some other announcements. I think.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yes, we can certainly do
I'll wait
that.
for
Tim.
Andrew, though. I'll wait for Andrew. Thank you.
Okay, sure. We'll circle back then. Anybody else waiting to say anything tonight before we turn to Andrew? Okay, Andrew, we'd love to hear from you first then. Thank you.
Sure. Just making sure I'm not muted. Okay. Thank you, Marjorie. I have a maybe a little bit longer than usual update tonight. And as Marjorie mentioned, I'm very much looking forward to sharing more information about our further reopening of schools in April. But before I get to that, I do want to speak to the horrific murders that took place in Atlanta, Georgia earlier this week. As we know, 8 people were killed and another person critically injured. And of the 8 killed, 6 were of Asian descent. And while there is currently debate that may go on for some time about the motive of the killer, there's no debate that this horrific event is one of many hateful crimes over the past year that mark a very dramatic increase in the overall crime rate in our country against Asian Americans and people of Asian descent. And we have to recognize and confront the fact that many more of our fellow citizens are now living in fear simply because of who they are, because of their ethnicity and their race. And this most recent rise in crime parallels to some degree the journey of the pandemic. In the last year, we were confronted with misinformation about the origins of the coronavirus. There was no shortage of conspiracy theories, and we've repeatedly heard offensive language, racial slurs used to label the virus. And now, once again, we are painfully reminded that the language that we choose and the misinformation that we spread can and do breed hate and hateful and tragic actions. And that's how this becomes a topic for a school superintendent in Westchester County to be talking about at a public meeting like this. As a school district, we have to think carefully about the use of language and help our students to use it thoughtfully and accurately. We stand up for truth rather than misinformation, for compassion and understanding. And of course, we stand against hate. And we will always work to create an environment for every student and every staff member that is not only compassionate and welcoming, but that helps each and every one know that their potential is great and their future bright. We know we have to be intentional in creating an environment that works against so much of what our students see and hear in the daily news and in their daily lives. And it's important for our students and our staff and our community to hear and to know that we condemn in the strongest possible terms all forms of bigotry and discrimination and hate, such as the events tragically that have taken place earlier in this week and sadly and tragically have continued for quite some time prior to that. Of course, our hearts break for the families impacted in Georgia this week and throughout the country on an ongoing basis. It's difficult to transition from that, but I do want to transition now to talk a little bit more about how we're going to start to bring students back, hopefully, as all goes according to plan, as soon as April 12th. To echo a little bit what Marjorie was saying a moment ago, I also want to express how grateful I am to all of our staff, our administrators, our teachers, all staff. It has been an incredible effort to have our schools open and to make the hybrid model work since September. And now all of these colleagues are shouldering this next enormous task of transitioning to a new model in just a few weeks so that we can welcome back all of our students. This week, our elementary principals and our middle school principal held information sessions for families so that they could learn more about how this transition is going to work. Dr. Siciliano has a session scheduled for high school families next Wednesday. Just a short while ago this evening, I sent a reminder to all families about the deadlines for letting us know if you want to change the model in which your child will be attending school for April, May, and June. And now I want to put some emphasis on this next point because this is important, I think. We've been able to maintain the hybrid model all year, and now we are transitioning away from it. The two options moving forward will be in person or fully remote. I think the hybrid was a very appropriate decision back in August when there was relatively little data and little research about in-person learning in schools and the virus. Since that time, there's been much more data and much more data collected and much more research done. And that has resulted in what you see happening today around the country and all around us here in Westchester and Putnam counties, which is a move to bring children back to school in larger numbers. Transmission of the virus in schools has been very, very low. If that weren't the case, we wouldn't be making this change now. When schools have applied appropriate mitigation strategies, they seem to have worked. Mandatory mask wearing, ventilation, hand washing, these seem to be the difference makers as to why the virus does, unfortunately, transmit in social settings where masks are not worn, and why it transmits in households among family members where, understandably, masks are not worn, and also why it does not transmit as readily in schools. And now I have to speak about distance, and there have been understandably questions from community members about the distance, the 6 foot, the 3 foot. It is true that the CDC on its website still indicates that 6 feet of distance is ideal when and if it can be maintained. It's also true, however, that states around the country and countries around the world have kept schools open with children sitting closer than 6 feet. And again, now with time, research and evidence strongly points to very low transmission of the virus in schools, even when the distance is as close as 3 feet, as long as those other mitigation strategies are in place. And we are far along enough now in our own planning to be able to say that our students will not be sitting closer than 3 feet. They will have at least that distance, and in many cases more than that distance, and that all the other mitigation strategies that we know are so important will absolutely stay in place. Now, understandably, this information doesn't comfort all families. As we've said on prior occasions, people's perspectives still vary considerably as we continue through this pandemic. And there's no way as a public school district that we can create enough models at the same time to suit every perspective that's out there. We think it's very important for our students to come back to school. We know in-person learning is better for academics and for social emotional well-being of our students. But we also know that we can't require all students to return while this pandemic continues, and while some families and students are understandably still cautious. So the fully remote option remains for those students. For those students who stay fully remote at secondary schools, they will continue to have opportunities to switch to in-person learning. We would love to have all of our students back before the end of the year, but we can no longer support daily switching back and forth between the models. In other words, a kind of self-created hybrid. It's too much for the system, and we don't think it's the best for our students. We really want them to be encouraged to come back just as soon as they are ready to really come back and make the commitment to that full-time in-person model. Our principals in the coming days will be communicating more about attendance and how that's going to work with these new models. Our elementary schools are working very hard right now based on the change requests that are still coming in to see how sections and staffing will work. As we've said before, the model has been different throughout the year at the elementary schools because of our commitment to creating fully remote sections with teachers and students dedicated to one another in a fully remote model since September. We think that was a good decision at the time, and we still think it's a good decision. It works well for those students. It does, however, make the transition more challenging now that some of those students who are fully remote want to come back to in-person, and the other way around. I think it must be, I imagine it's fairly easy to imagine the complications that creates. So again, our principals are working hard right now to make those transitions happen. There may be some teacher changes in some cases. We would obviously work to minimize those. But our families, we want our families to understand that we're doing everything we can to create the models that they've asked for as we move forward. I've had a number of questions about quarantining, so I do want to just spend a moment on this. A frequent question in recent days has simply been how many students are quarantining. So I can't give exact numbers on that, but I think it's fair to give families a sense. You see those emails that go home not quite nightly, but almost nightly, with reports about a COVID case that was determined to be positive that day. And you'll see next to it that either it was necessary to do contact tracing or it was not. What we can say since the most recent changes in the guidance around quarantining is that the numbers at elementary school tend to be about the size of half a class while we're in the cohort model, because quarantining in the elementary schools is generally due to lunch and that period of time when masks are removed. At secondary schools, the numbers have generally been smaller than that for each case. So I don't want to give false impression, but I do want to help our families understand that at the beginning of the year, when the rules were different, we saw much longer lists needing to quarantine. Those lists have gotten smaller. The bus, of course, can have impact. We should expect that when more students are in school, the numbers will rise. I can't say now whether they'll rise dramatically. Hopefully they won't, because we work inside a perimeter around the person who was the positive case in order to determine who needs to quarantine, but we should expect they will rise a bit. And we've had some people ask, well, why can't you just change the rules around quarantining? We don't make the rules. The County Department of Health, along with New York State Department of Health, give us the rules, and they are the ones to whom we must report those people who are contacts in school, and they will determine who quarantines and who doesn't. With all of that said, we are very eager to see our students return to school. And again, what we hope will be just a few short weeks, as I mentioned before. We've ordered those barriers. I've had some people ask me about the barriers too, and what I've continued to say there, they are a mandate from New York State. We have to have them in order to bring our students back to school. I haven't said anything more about them with intention. We simply have to have them in order to bring our students back to school at distances less than 6 feet. So they are on order. We hope they come in time, and we're excited to notify our community just as soon as we're ready, hopefully on those dates that we've given, to welcome all of our students back to school. I want to make one more announcement, and then certainly if the board has questions about anything that I've just shared, I'd be happy to take those questions. But I did want to mention, since I do think we may have made the news today along with some other school districts because of an issue having to do with the water supply, in our case at Meadowpond Elementary School yesterday, we learned that the New York State Department of Health and Westchester County Department of Health were issuing something that's known as a do not drink advisory for the water at Meadowpond Elementary School. We were one of 2 schools in Westchester. There were also a number of other schools around the state that received this notice on the same day. And I can't say fast enough that our students and our staff at Meadowpond have been drinking bottled water for some time due to some other issues with the well water that we have been working to remediate. So yesterday's announcement didn't change daily life in the school. The bottled water was already there. That water obviously is safe to drink, and we didn't need to make changes because of yesterday's announcement. We will need to make some changes in the future as we work forward to remediate the water. The advisory is the result of a new, very recently conducted test that found higher than acceptable levels of 2 substances known as PFOAs and PFOSs. I won't attempt to pronounce what those acronyms stand for, but the information, all the information is available on our website for anybody who wishes to read more. You can see it on the facilities page. We certainly notified all of our Meadowpond families yesterday, just as soon as we became aware of this information. And again, in the meantime, everybody at Meadowpond continues to have access to bottled water for drinking. The kitchen is using bottled water for food preparation. And the well water that we continue to use for hand washing and other activities is absolutely safe for those purposes. And that, I think, does finally bring me to the end of tonight's update.
Well, first, let us just take a moment to thank you so much for, keeping us apprised of infrastructural issues and all of the work and coordination and information that you're providing to the board and to the community regarding efforts to more fully reopen schools and providing some clarification around questions that have emerged over the past couple of weeks, and also for raising consciousness and condemning racially motivated acts of violence, and for reaffirming our commitment as a district to the dignity of all human life. We appreciate your ability to take us through the range of topics and events. And I am going to pause here because I know at least Terrence is waiting to say something, and perhaps other board members also have clarifying questions or comments they'd like to make. And I'm happy to turn the floor over to you, Terrence.
Thank you. And also, I'm going to try to be brief. And Andrew, again, I really appreciate you and your administrative leadership team. You know, you're always at the table, and that means more than you know. I think especially to, you know, the people of color in our community who don't necessarily always see themselves in the community, but your voice, you know, includes them, and it definitely makes people feel seen and heard, and that's just so important. I'm just going to go a little bit further from both a parent perspective as well as a board trustee perspective. I would really encourage, you know, the staffs, especially in the high school and the middle school, whenever possible, whether you're the guidance counselors or a teacher, classroom teacher, to support the students by being intrusive or engaged in maybe extra ways, if and when possible. I think that's really important, as awkward as that might seem. I remember a student in the ERJ, you know, making a comment about feeling invisible, right? And I think this is a big part, especially when we're talking about anti-Asian racism. So I think being able to talk about it, especially in the classroom, is absolutely critical to being seen and heard. And I think how we talk about nuance in these situations is also critical. And so, you know, what I would say is that a key lesson in some of this is the nuance and the manipulation of narrative, especially in the media, and how simple that is, and how these are devices in perpetuating systemic racism, especially as our district is, you know, working so hard in the Equity and Racial Justice Committee. I think these are the kinds of things that I hope our faculty and our staff are absorbing and appreciating, right? How the narrative of the Georgia murderer is already being manipulated into, you know, being a hand pointing us away from racism, but pointing to other things like sex addiction, and how the sheriff, the spokesman for the sheriff's office, is saying things like, you know, he had a really bad day. It was a really bad day for him, showing empathy for a murderer and not showing empathy for victims, 8 victims, 6 of whom are Asian. You know, how we in the media haven't heard, but have heard through social media, how this spokesperson for the sheriff's office actually has posted on his personal social media pages, you know, buying shirts and paraphernalia that have anti-Asian slogans on them, having done that in the past year, saying things like, place your order while they last. This media coverage that denigrates and dehumanizes victims by framing their work and their sexuality in a way that makes it easy for us to kind of cast them away or look down on them. So I hope our faculty and our staff are up to the challenge of embracing that kind of nuance, because our students are sophisticated and they're intelligent and they're able to understand and process all of that. It's on us to bring that to them, okay, and to challenge them with that. So that would be my call. That would be my challenge to our team, who is already so incredible, but remarkable times require even more remarkable effort. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Terrence. Yes, Bill.
Very briefly, I don't want to take away from the eloquence of the 2 previous speakers, but I do want to applaud the urge to speak out. You know, how is this relevant to a Westchester community? I think certainly people on the other side, if you will, speak out. And you know, the saying is, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. I would say for good people to say nothing is also a problem. So just by speaking out, I think has meaning, and I applaud it.
Thank you.
Can I say something too?
Please.
And I don't mean to take away from this really important conversation, but I know that there's been a lot of comments recently on Facebook that I've witnessed. I know there's a lot of excitement. I know there's a lot of anxieties. I know there's a lot of worry about coming back to school. Some of the comments that I've seen are some criticisms. I guess I want to reiterate to the parents and to the population, the community, that I really think our district tries to be very transparent and very communicative and very open. I want to remind or reiterate what I learned from Andrew, and that, please go to your teacher if you have a concern or a worry. And after the teacher, you should go to the principal. And if that doesn't work, go to Andrew, because he welcomes your comments and your concerns and your opinions. I've had 5 children in the district, and I've used that chain of command, and I have witnessed every single time very transparent and very communicative responses. I also want to let everybody know that, we as board members, and I believe I speak for all of my colleagues, but we were elected by you guys, and we want to represent you. So my door is open too. Please feel free to call if you have a comment. We want to be there for you. We want to represent you. So I want everybody to know that I think we're all here, and we want to be as communicative and open and transparent as we can. Please reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Any further comments, clarifying questions for Andrew? Yes, please, Sawyer.
I also just wanted to thank you for what you said. I think that for many students, and especially students who are heavily impacted by seeing violence against people who are like them and discrimination against people like them, I think that to hear kind of the leader of their community speak out against it is a really powerful and important thing. And hopefully it makes them feel more supported. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you, Sawyer.
Thank you. Okay. If there are no further comments, then I think we're going to turn our attention to continued discussion of the proposed budget. And as we're preparing to do that, I'll just mention for members of the community who are waiting to ask questions or who have joined us because they might want to make a comment or share thoughts or concerns with us. After this discussion, we'll turn our attention to public forum. And please feel free to use the chat at the bottom of your screen. Please let us know who you are and where you live in the district. And we'll turn our attention to public forum just after this presentation. So thanks for your patience in the meantime. And with that, I think we are ready to return to the budget, and I'll turn it over to you, Andrew and Danelle. Thank you.
Marjorie. So as again, as you mentioned before, we do want to talk a little bit about the budget itself tonight, but we want to begin by, we hope, helping the board and our community to understand what's been in the media actually a lot recently, which is the recently passed $1.9 trillion legislation from Washington known as the American Rescue Plan. There's been quite a bit of reporting about how the money from that plan is going to flow to the states. What's a little bit challenging for us is it's still in the very early stages. So even though you're seeing some newspaper reports with dollar amounts in them, and I think we're going to even share some of those with you tonight, they're preliminary numbers. And the money still has to work its way through the state and then find its way to districts. And we know that changes can continue to occur. So we want to share it tonight with that caveat and talk about how we think it relates to the budgeting process and where we are at the moment. And with that, I will turn over to Danelle. Thanks, Danelle.
Thanks, Andrew. I just want to make sure everybody's seeing the correct screen.
Yep.
Okay, great. So that was a good lead-in. Tonight, we're just going to go over how the federal stimulus packages affect Katona-Lewisboro. So last week, on March 11th, President Biden signed a $1.9 trillion relief package. This relief package, as Andrew said, is also known as the American Rescue Plan. So to walk you through the $1.9 trillion bill, $12.5 billion was allocated to New York State, and that allocation was to help New York State balance their budget. An additional $8.99 billion was allocated for K-12 education. So of that $8.99 billion that was allocated to New York for their K-12 education, $8.09 billion of that was to local education agencies, also referred to as LEAs. So an LEA is your public school districts. So what that means is it's different from some other stimulus packages where we had to reach out to private schools in our area. The $8.09 billion will be set just to the schools districts. So what does that mean for Katona-Lewis Borough? Like Andrew said, these are estimated numbers. So according to Senator Schumer's office, Katona-Lewis Borough's portion is $587,000. I can't stress enough that this is an estimate. Of course, the governor and the legislature will actually allocate the exact funds. But I just wanted to show you a little bit of how things trickle down from that 1.9 trillion federal relief. So even though we don't know if the 587,000 is going to be what we wound up with, it's an estimate. What we do know is that the allocation will be a 80% that will be required to allocate. So using that 587,000 estimate, 20% would have to go towards what's called learning loss due to the pandemic. So that's $117,400. The remaining $469,600, or 80% of that pie, is allocated for activities that are necessary to maintain the continuity of service at the school district. So just to jog your memory, the American Rescue Plan is the third round of stimulus funds that we have utilized to help balance our budget. The first round was known as the Coronavirus Relief and Economic Securities Act, or CARES Act. So that was $103,837. We knew that amount when we were projecting out our revenue for 2021. So that is built into this current year's budget. Back in February, when we presented the budget, we also knew of the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, otherwise known as CRRSA. So that was $309,956. And we used that to help offset what we thought was going to be a revenue shortfall in state aid, and that helped balance our revenue budget. So this final $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, the projected allocation $587,000. So there is a clause in that we can use that money over a 3-year span of time. So, but it must be used by September 2023. In all 3 of these stimulus rounds, there was a stipulation that said we could apply for a 12-month extension to use these funds in a future years. But generally speaking, these are where the federal government has requested we spend the money. Ooh, excuse me.
Danelle, can we pause on this slide
Sure.
for a moment? I want to, you'll have to help me perhaps on this one, but I think it's important for the board to understand that the way the New York State allocated the 309,000, the amount in the middle there, if I understand correctly, actually they withheld $309,000 that we otherwise would have received in our usual state aid and replaced it with this federal funding. So
that is correct. Yes.
And which is not to be critical, not to place any blame. There was at the time a tremendous shortfall in the New York State budget, right? So they were looking for ways to try to balance their budget. So they received this infusion from Washington, and they know they have to allocate it to the schools. But rather than what I don't want the community to think is that we then suddenly received sort of a bonus of an additional 309,000. We received what we anticipated we would be receiving, rather than perhaps this kinds of significant cuts that were being talked about last year. And like any state aid, we make expenditures first, And then we get reimbursed through state aid in most cases for those expenditures. So it's also not just that we receive additional cash to do whatever we want with. We make expenditures on things that we need, and in many cases, things specifically to do with the pandemic, and then we'll get reimbursed for those items.
So yes, that's absolutely correct, Andrew. So we receive what's called the governor's budget. And it's always essentially a first drafted budget because all budgets have to go to the legislative floor. So the governor had been projecting that the state would have some shortfalls. And knowing that, he reduced state aid and was anticipating the federal government to supplement the state aid with this $309,956.
And moving, yeah, I think that's very helpful. And moving forward, this is one of the unknowns. We don't know if the $587,000 is actually going to be $587,000, and we also don't know if it's going to be additional funding on top of the state aid that previously was estimated to be provided to us, or whether the same thing will happen as happened with the $309,000, and it'll be used to supplant aid that would have otherwise been coming to us anyway from the state. So that's yet to be determined.
So given what we know now, under those assumptions that we would get the $309,956 and be eligible for the $587,000, we could potentially use this all in 1 year in 21-22. So if we take the $309,956 and the $587, we're looking at additional revenue of $896,956, or I shouldn't say additional revenue, but revenue made up for from the state aid. And that could be a shortfall in 22-23. So if the state is being supplanted by the federal government, this close to 900,000, and it's not in 22-23, then we would see an effect of that in our revenue source, and we would have this revenue shortfall from 1 year to the next. So knowing that that 587,000 could be spread over 3 years, it would be prudent of the district to do this slight ease of that additional money over that 3-year period. So breaking it apart, 21-22, we would use $195,666. And then in 22-23 and 23-24, we'd use $195,667. And this would help reduce that revenue peak and then a revenue drop.
Danelle, just on that, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a split for the 587. It looked like about 20% was going to a category called learning loss.
Yes.
Which I think is the shortfall, I guess, from our students based on their inability to be in school last year or whatever. I'm not quite sure what that learning loss is, but are we allowed to spend that 20% over the 3 years, or is there any criteria at this level lower than the full 587? In other words, I would think that 117, we would expect to spend that in the near term rather than over 3 years. And maybe it doesn't really matter.
Right. So the guidance is still being put out there, and we haven't received full guidance on this yet. But I would imagine that would be so, Rory, and I would think that we would want to do that as a school district, is make up that learning losses as soon as we could. But I don't have that information as of yet.
And if that were the case, if we did want to front load it, then I just wonder whether that would impact the split rather than having an even split over 3 years. Maybe you want to make it a little bit heavier on the first year, but okay, just a thought. Thank you for that.
So I just wanted to show you this last slide. This is what we had currently proposed to you back in February, our revenue budget. There'd be 2 lines that would be affected by whatever dollar amount we do get in additional state aid. So in order to balance the budget, our budget is $113,242,880. That's what we proposed to you last month. So we always have to balance that with the revenue side. You can only expend what you take in. We look at our other revenue sources, and then what we can't make in other revenue sources, that's where the property tax levy comes from. So if we were to increase that second circled point of $8,292,486, if that increases, then the property taxes would decrease. So currently we're projecting a levy to levy increase of 1.79%. If we use the $195,666, or a third of that $587,000, that would reduce our tax levy increase to about 1.58%. Now our budget to budget increase is 1.59%. So reducing that property tax to 1.58% would be online with our budget to budget increase. I just want to also remind the board that the board sets the tax levy at the end of July. So I think at that point, we will have a lot more clear, definite dollar amounts and answers for you, rather than giving you projected estimates. So hopefully by July, we would know that. The federal government does have a stipulation that once they send New York State the funds, they must be distributed within 60 days. But that is once New York State receives them. And there has been no formal guideline of when the states are going to be receiving them.
Danelle, can we stay on this slide also for a
Sure,
moment?
yeah.
I'm going to risk repeating myself, but I think
Mhm.
I think it's illustrated well with this slide. But you'll correct me again if I go wrong here. When the board looks here at the two state aid numbers, this year's number and next year's number, you can see the proposed number next year is lower, 8.29 million, 8.292 million versus 8.303 million. And that number, the 8.292 number, includes already the $309,000 from that second round of stimulus. Is that correct, Danelle?
Yes.
So again, there's a tendency, I think, when people hear about these stimulus amount of money is coming in, they must think, that's great, the district's getting more money. But in fact, you can see how state aid with that $309,000 in it is lower next year than it is in the current year. And what we still don't know is whether the 500 and something thousand dollars, whether it's even going to change this number. It depends on how the state decides to roll it out to the districts. You know, we hope and think that this number would be higher, but until the state makes that determination as to what it's going to do and how it's going to use these additional funds, it's harder to be sure. It does seem a little bit more likely because of, and Danelle pointed this out in the first slide, because the federal government specifically this time around said, here's $12 billion to balance your budget, and here's another $8 billion to go to schools. It would seem, you would think, harder for the state to then say, well, we're going to use some of that other money to balance that budget too. So perhaps we will in fact get more, but it's just too early for us to know at this point exactly how that's going to work out. Thank you,
Right.
Danelle.
Thank you. Is there any slides that you would like to reference back to before I stop sharing my screen for some conversation? Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much for preparing the slides and for the overview of the different stages and the administration of the stages of aid, which is to say the supplanting of the state aid with the federal money that came in earlier. I think we understand what you're saying about the timeline and that this is something we can anticipate in, I guess, future weeks or months. We'll be hearing more about this. You'll be receiving additional guidance in terms of whether those percentages would also be applicable to each of the thirds, should we divide it in thirds, et cetera. And even as to whether the 587,000 continues to be the number. But it is very helpful to be apprised, you know, just up until this point in time, since we are still in process with our budget deliberations overall. So we really thank you for taking the time to provide this context for us in terms of possible impact to revenue. Any other clarifying questions or just comments or perspectives on all of the above? Okay, then thank you so much. We really appreciate that.
So can I also just add, so we have the expenditure side budget slides that you've seen previously, which we still have standing by tonight in case there are any questions, but there haven't been any changes to those slides. So, and I think we've addressed the board's questions. We certainly, though, would want to know if there are any additional questions. If there aren't, then if we're still on track to move towards adoption at the next meeting, we would go through some of those slides one more time to do another review for the board and the community of what's there, but they'll look very familiar again, unless if there were any additional questions, we would love to hear those tonight.
Maybe just a point of clarification. When we adopt the budget, are we adopting both sides, the expenditure and the revenue side at the same time?
Yeah, the revenue side is the levy is actually set at
That's
the end of
tax
July.
levy in July. Gotcha. Okay. Yep. Thank you. No, all good.
So at the moment, our schedule is to come back next week and review the proposed budget one more time. And then at that point, we would vote on a resolution to adopt the proposed budget, and then it becomes the Board of Education's budget. And there would be further outreach to the community to provide education and invite questions and comments from community members in the individual schools and that sort of thing. And we'll have a budget hearing also. So that's the timeline that we had established. I think we're on track. And it looks like we will look forward to coming back next week to adopt the budget.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this brings us to public forum. And I'm not sure whether any comments have come into the Q&A or whether perhaps any comments were submitted previously to the public forum email account. But whenever you're ready, Kim, I'd love to turn it over to you for any insight you can share. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. At this time, there are no comments submitted to the BOE Public Forum email, and I also do not see any comments in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, thanks to members of our community for joining us tonight. And I think we will then move on to our consent agenda. So now we're at 9.01, and I'm not aware of any items that are being pulled out to be voted on separately, but I'll just pause just in case. Okay, and if not, then would somebody like to move the consent agenda? Thank you, Julia. And it looks like Liz has seconded it. Are there any questions or comments about items on the consent agenda? Nope. Okay, then I think we can go ahead and vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Great. 7-0. Okay, thank you. And I think, let me just confirm. I think we're at board dialogue and discussion now. And I'll just pause. I'm not sure whether board members brought additional topics for tonight. I had just one additional topic that I wondered if we might want to revisit, because I recall that in between our last public board meeting and tonight's meeting, there has been some recent decision-making, even if it's also still not final decision-making, around the requirement to administer testing for grades 3 through 8 and a minimum number of Regents exams. And my understanding is that on Monday, this information was provisionally provided by the New York State Ed Department, although a waiver to the federal government is still pending. So I think, again, we're in a position where we're not really dealing with final guidance, but still we have to plan and move forward. And I think, especially in light of the reality that we are working so hard to bring our students all back to school with, in some cases, in many cases, joyous anticipation and concern. I just wondered if you might want to take a minute, Andrew, to share your thoughts and perspective on kind of how this is shaping up and what it means for our students and our faculty.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks, Marjorie.
Thank you.
So as you mentioned, the Board of Regents were meeting on Monday and Tuesday of this week. And I do want to give credit, what I think is credit to New York State for really working hard to to try to appeal to the federal government in Washington to gain a waiver and not have to administer these tests in this year. And for people who may not understand, the federal government requires states to do a certain amount of testing in order to qualify for federal funding that comes in. And that's all to do with having accountability to make sure that schools are doing the best job they can and serving their students. And a big piece of the federal government's involvement is around equity and wanting to make sure that all children across the country are served in an equitable manner. And standardized testing is one of the mechanisms they use in order to gauge whether things are in fact equitable. And so you can understand the reluctance on the federal government's part to let it go entirely. At the same time, I'll say, for myself and on behalf of our school district, the timing of standardized testing arriving at this particular moment is rather unfortunate, to say the least. Towards the end of this pandemic interrupted year, as you mentioned, when we're just about to, we hope, joyously welcome all of our students back into school, to some extent, the last thing we would want to do is sit them down for standardized tests. It just so happens that the first, and as you said, these things are pending. The state is still saying that there's a waiver application out there. I think it's fair to say it seems unlikely at this point. And that's why I think the state has gone ahead now and they've provided schedules and some guidelines for how the 3 through 8 tests are to be administered. There's a window that actually begins on April 19th, which is that first Monday when we hope all of our grades are back in full time. That's when the testing can begin, but there's a window of a few weeks there in which we're allowed to administer the first section. And they have reduced at least the amount of testing that's required. So typically there'd be at least 2 sections. I think now it's just 1 section that has to be administered. I would like to say that our focus is going to be on creating the best educational environment we can for our students, as we have done all year and through to the end of this year. We don't want our teachers to suddenly shift into test preparation mode just at the moment when all students are arriving back in school. We think that the best way to prepare for a test is to continue with good classroom practice and engaging and meaningful learning experiences. And we're going to be encouraging our teachers to do that, on top of the fact that we know testing can be a stressful experience for students of all ages, as well as sometimes for the teachers who are preparing them. And the last thing, again, we want to do in this pandemic-driven year is add another stressor to the lives of our students. So that's, again, knowing that it has to be administered, we will certainly comply with the state's mandate, but we will do our best to minimize the impact on all other aspects of life in the classrooms. And then just to touch briefly, we know a little less about the Regents exams. We do know what you've just said, which is, again, the state has tried to gain a waiver, and in the absence of being able to gain a waiver, they've resorted to the minimum required number of Regents exams. So again, the federal government requires high school students to be tested, I believe it's actually just once in their 4 years, by a standardized test in the areas of English, math, and science. So that relates to the few Regents that the state has to require. So again, we will certainly help our students to do the best they can, but at the same time, minimize the impact to the extent we can on our students being able to come back and have what we hope will be a really terrific end to this year, and for our teachers to be able to keep doing the kind of meaningful instruction that they always do on a daily basis, and not suddenly have to switch gears and go into a test prep mode. So we don't know as much about Regents at this point. There's been no guidelines shared with us from the state other than a schedule of the time in June of when they would be administered. So we'll know more as they provide us more information, probably in the coming weeks.
Thanks a lot for providing the additional context and insight regarding, how we would hope to mitigate any potential impact on students and families and on our staff. So it's very helpful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Any other questions about that or other topics that people were looking to be updated on since the last time? Yes,
Yeah,
please, Catherine.
Do you have any sense in terms of there's also been a lot of discussion about just final exams, not actually standardized tests, but have you come, or has the high school come to any decision about finals, whether they'll occur or not occur this year?
I would say not yet, Catherine. Our focus for now is on, it's a lot of planning just to get everybody back. And I would say as soon as we're through that, we'll be talking about that. Again, I think I can safely say what I just said about state exams, I hope will be true of the entire experience. Our goal really is to re-engage our students in in-person learning and in what I would hope would be the most joyous aspects of in-person learning and the kinds of things that will want our students, whether they're seniors going on to college or whether they're seniors going on to do other things or whether they're younger students who are coming back to us next year, we would love for them to end in June wanting only to continue. Testing doesn't always have that impact, so we will, but of course testing has a function also, an important function, so we don't overlook it altogether. So we'll be thinking about that in the coming weeks and reaching some conclusions about that.
I love sticking with the joyous.
We shall see. Marjorie, I had one other topic, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, please.
It's somewhat mundane, but also important. I've had a few questions about the state's travel advisory in light of spring break approaching. And a lot of people heard the governor's comment, I think it's a couple of weeks ago already, when he mentioned that as of April 1st, there wouldn't be any more travel advisory or need to quarantine. So I think it's really important for people to know that although he did say that in a press conference, if you go to the New York State Travel Advisory website, you'll see that it actually hasn't changed yet. It has changed in the sense that people who are fully vaccinated can now be excused from quarantining, but it says nothing about the April 1st date on it. So I just advise people that at the moment, at least, there is quarantine that's still required after travel to, I think it's non-contiguous states, non-contiguous to New York. And you can shorten the quarantine by testing, by doing COVID testing before travel, during travel, and after travel. But there's no total exemption from quarantine unless you've been fully vaccinated or, I believe, previously tested positive for COVID. Again, that may change. The governor did say it, and perhaps they're just slow to update the actual guidance. And people have also asked, will Katona-Lewisboro be enforcing this travel advisory? The answer to that is it's really not our decision or our choice as to whether or not to revise it. That's a state piece of guidance for the state to enforce. I believe travelers fill out health forms upon return to New York State. And so, we certainly hope and expect and encourage all of our families and our colleagues to follow the laws and the regulations of our state. Those are not things that we make decisions about.
There may also be different guidelines for any international travel.
Right.
So again, people just need to be mindful and just keep going to the website and be informed.
Thanks, Alice.
Andrew, do you think that will cause any concern? As you said in the beginning, we really want people to make that decision about either being fully remote or fully present. And so for students who may be going away over the April break or March, April break, and then coming back and wanting to really follow those guidelines appropriately, which I don't know the length of the quarantining when you come back. Is it 10 days or is it?
Well, I think 10
Depends on
days
where you
is
go.
the standard, but it can be shortened if you test. I think it
Okay.
can be shortened to 3 or 4 days if you take COVID tests.
Got it. So just to alleviate, I think, I mean, that would, I know we're not bringing that first week, we're not bringing everyone back. So I guess
Right.
So without it having to be 10 days, if people come back on Saturday, let's say, by that Monday, they should be clear from that 10-day period, I guess. Okay. I'm just thinking about people sort of being anxious about, I'm supposed to make a commitment and now I need to quarantine and kind of feeling stuck.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think
So,
that's a good segue though, also for us to emphasize again, there's still going to be the daily health screener in place. People are going to have to do that every day, and we don't want anybody coming to school who fails that health screener. And being quarantined obviously is, or having had contact with a person who's positive, or having been quarantined by the state for any reason. We don't hold that against somebody. We wouldn't want them to come to school under those conditions. So it doesn't necessarily change the learning model that they're enrolled in.
Andrew, I think you made a really good point. Thank you for doing this, that, when we bring students back, I think it's inevitable that we're going to see cases in our schools. It's inevitable. It's just, it's math, right? Like that's all there is to it. It's just math. And I'm going to steal Bill's medical analytical thunder for a second, but let's just look at the statistics across the country. The pandemic is not even close to over. And if you look at the numbers nationally, you look at the numbers locally, it is not even close to over. So, I would just really, I just really just want to remind all of our neighbors and community members and parents and families and students, please just continue to do the things that have been effective, and if you do have to travel, just continue to just slather yourself up with Purell and wear a mask or 2 or 3 at a time. And because we're not out of the woods yet. Okay. So we just got to do everything we can to keep each other safe.
Terrence, thank you for that. I do, though, I want to add right onto that, though, because when people hear that, and I think what you said is absolutely appropriate and accurate, I think that's also one of the things that makes people wonder, so why are we making this transition at this time? And so again, I want to immediately reiterate, the pandemic is not over. However, transmission is not occurring in schools. So cases may come into school and that person will go home immediately, and people who that person has had contact with will quarantine. What we haven't seen is those people who've had to quarantine now become sick because of the contact in school. That's the really important piece. So I think you're right. There will continue to be cases that will come from outside, that will come into the school. The more careful we can be in our daily lives everywhere we go, the more we reduce that chance. But it will happen. People will have to quarantine. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be reopening schools. I don't think. It means, it means there'll be some days when people can't be here. But on the whole, we hope most people will be here most of the days, which has been true, throughout the year. We've been as a community, we've been pretty good. We haven't had too many shutdowns. We've had our share of positive cases for sure, and we've had our share of quarantining. But by and large, our schools have stayed open in the hybrid model, which has been great. And we hope the same will be true as we move forward into this new model.
And I would emphasize that the transmission rate is low in schools because of the mitigation factors. It's not inherent in the building, although young people are probably less susceptible to severe disease. What makes the school, people are doing the things they have to do in the schools. So that's why it's working. So these barriers and most importantly, masks.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions, actually. First of all, I was just wondering, anecdotally, I should say, I've heard many students, particularly seniors, who are interested in getting a vaccine before they come to school, or are concerned that if they sign up for an in-person 5-day model, they won't be able to, they would be concerned about playing sports for the school and then possibly infecting others. And I think that there's real questions about the flexibility in the plan and whether or not there will be any flexibility allowed to some students who may be interested in coming to school, but not want to put other students at risk or not want to put themselves at risk until they've been vaccinated. So is there any enforcement of whether or not people come to school? Because as of now, the hybrid model doesn't seem to really be enforced. So will there be some kind of enforcement going forward?
It's a really good question, Sawyer. And it's one that our secondary schools are discussing actually collectively at the moment. I think what I would say is there won't be the degree of flexibility there is now. So in other words, it won't be possible for a student to decide on Monday, I'm going to go to school, but on Tuesday, I'm not. I'm going to stay home. That level of flexibility, we're going to really work hard to discourage, because we don't think it's good for the students, and it also makes the teaching experience very challenging, which is not good for everybody. But at the same time, as I said earlier, we recognize that a student may choose, they may feel it's in their best interest to stay remote for a period of time, for a matter of weeks when this process begins, and then at a certain point say, now I'm ready to come in. And at that point, in communication with the school, I think that kind of decision will be allowed. And then the expectation and the hope will be, now you're in, great. We expect to see you every day. That's the hope at this point, as with so many things through the pandemic. Some of this we'll have to figure out as we go, because we've never done this before. I think it's important to remind everybody of that. We had never done a hybrid model in September, and we figured it out. And there was some things we had to figure out as it was unfolding in those first few weeks. We've never done a fully in-person and fully remote model before. So some things we'll have to work out as we go. But I think you'll see more communication in the next few days, and maybe hear more from Dr. Siciliano next week. You said you had a second question, though.
I do. So late this afternoon, I was looking at my school email, and I got an email containing a petition from high school and middle school students about the 5-day school week, and just many students expressing real concern with losing their virtual Wednesdays, or not virtual, but their asynchronous Wednesdays. And it's unfortunate this is coming so kind of late in the game, but so far it looks like the petition is 740-ish signatures. And there's real discomfort, I think, within the students and community, especially secondary students, regarding mental health concerns, and then just concerns for personal well-being. And I was wondering what the district could possibly do to help students out in these conditions, because people are reporting being on screens for over 16 hours when they're in the virtual model, with all the homework that we're receiving every day, and just kind of being overwhelmed and flooded with the work that we get every day.
Okay.
Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, I'll say thank you for sharing it. And while you said, it's unfortunate that it's coming so late, I actually want to applaud our students for, having their voices and speaking up in that way. I think I haven't received the petition, but I think it's fantastic that our students are looking for ways to make themselves heard. That's what students should do always. So, and this is an interesting one, because it sounds to me like there might be some interesting conversations going on around dining room tables, because our students' parents said in pretty large numbers, we want our students to be in school 5 days a week. So I think we have some very interesting thinking to do, and maybe some conversation to have as a community about what makes the most sense. I think the point you make about screens is one that is very compelling to all of us. That's why we would really love to see all of our students back in school, where the screens wouldn't be necessary, right? We would go back to in-person learning. There would be, computers would be used some of the time, but not as the primary means of education as they've become. And even as I say that, of course, there are, for some students and some families, there's just not the comfort level yet to come back to school. So those screens will be necessary for that reason. So there's not an easy answer to that very good question, Sawyer. I'm glad you asked it. It's the first I'm hearing, so we'll certainly start to have conversation in the same way that Catherine earlier said, that those conversations that happen on Facebook, we would love them to come directly to us. And we look forward to this one coming to us also, when the students are ready to speak directly to us, and we can work with them and try to figure out what makes the most sense. That was a lengthy non-answer.
Thank you for bringing it to our attention, Sawyer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any additional comments or questions? topics? Okay, if not, then we can look ahead to future meetings. And I think as has been mentioned previously, the board's going to meet again next week, March 25th. And that will be our opportunity to vote on a resolution to adopt the proposed budget. We'll be meeting at 7:30. In between now and then, it looks like audit is going to meet Monday morning at, no, pardon me, Monday evening, 7 p.m. And policy is going to meet Friday, March 26th at 9 a.m. And that'll bring us to the end of the month. And if
Is
that's,
policy, Kim, is that meeting on or off?
That one's on, but I think you mentioned you weren't able to attend,
Right.
and we were scheduling another one, but due to trying to get as many policies done by the end of the year, we were going to
Sure.
hold the meeting.
So life does go on without me. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
okay, thanks for clarifying. And if nobody's waiting to add any additional meetings, then would somebody like to make a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Rory, seconded by Bill. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Terrific. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay
Good night.
well, and we look forward to coming back next week. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Marjorie.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.